Let's finish up the kinship stuff. This should be pretty straightforward. It should be fairly short. I just sent you a next year assignments. It's a very short video. I think it's less than 5 minutes. Very cleverly done from a couple of years ago, sort of critiquing Instagram, called InstaLie, which you might be familiar with. So watch that, answer that reaction. In that context, then sort of think about this, especially as I mentioned last time I was talking about this whole idea, the idea of stranger, people you don't know. Which I would argue for the vast majority of people includes a large part of what they is their sort of social media network that oftentimes they consider friends, is people have no idea who or what that person is. And that little video is just a very clever example of that. In fact, if I can, I'll see if I can find another one, which is this whole idea of catfishing, which is a fascinating example of something sort of similar that you might be familiar with. Okay, last of the areas dealing with kinship is the idea of marriage residence. And so in the idea of marriage residence, again, there's a fair number of terms. But they're not really that hard to figure out if you just break them up. So just like the idea of family identity, if it's unilineal, matrilineal, patrilineal, a marriage residence breaks down very much the same thing. So if you look at, for example, the idea of matrilocal, what that means is when a couple gets married, they move in with the mother's side of the family. So this would be on the wife's side of the family too. So locality means that you move there. The first part is, what gender and what side of the marriage relationship does so. So matra meaning mother or the wife's side. So they move in with the wife's family. Patrilocal would mean that you move in with the husband's family. Neolocal, neo meaning new, would be, and this is the stereotypic American one, when a couple gets married, they move into their own place, so they don't stay with either family. The ambilocal is pretty straightforward. This is basically you choose. You have to live with someone, but you choose between whether it's going to be the husband's relatives or the wife's relatives. This is actually really rare, and if you think about it for a second, it makes a fair amount of sense that it would be rare, because there's almost invariably going to be a fair amount of stress generated. If the couple that's getting married actually are functional, useful members of the group, then both families would like to have them living with them because they're going to help out with stuff. So there's going to be a fair amount of stress and competition getting them. If, on the other hand, they're both couch potatoes and don't do anything, then both sides of the family are going to want them around. So ambilocal is actually really, really rare because families and people generate enough conflict with having to look for designed ways to do so. So ambilocal is actually really rare. Ironically, one of the places you find it, and there's actually some logic to it, would be in the eastern part of Micronesia, especially from basically the Marshalls through into Kiribati. And there's actually, that has to do with the limited amount of resources. We don't have time to go over it in this class, but that's one of the few areas you see. It's usually tied to the fact that there are a limited amount of resources, and the resources are variable depending on one family to the other. So that would drive, where you live. So matrilocal, patrilocal, these are almost invariably tied to the kinship identity system. So if you're in a male-dominated society where people trace descent through males, then not surprisingly, in most of those societies, you're going to have patrilocal. And I should point out that patrilocal is by far the most common in global, and when you look at the totality of societies. Matra is a second, and neolocal is a really, really rare third. Patrilocal, and you have to remember the reason for that is in most societies, when couples marry, families expect them to move in with someone. So the idea that a couple is supposed to be independent when they marry is really foreign and pretty alien, and oftentimes pretty distasteful in most societies. They don't understand that. To them, couples are parts of families, and families are such a dominant force in people's lives that you should move in and stay with someone. This is one of the dramatic differences between us here in Hawaii and the U.S. mainland. The U.S. mainland statistically is a neolocal system. And the U.S. mainland, the majority of folks live by themselves when they get married. And if they don't, they immediately try to as soon as possible. In fact, on much of the mainland, there's a pretty strong negative stereotype attached if a married couple is still living with one set of parents or the other. There's a sense that somehow they're sort of taking advantage of the situation. Ironically, given the changing economic situations, in many cases, people are having to do that, but it's not socially acceptable. Here in Hawaii, it's the norm. The majority population here live with a set of parents or live with a set of the extended family on one side or the other, usually patrilineal in the sense of the husband side of the family. And that makes sense, one, economically, because people generally can't afford to, but also because most of the population here is Asian in background. And in Asian background systems, a family is more important than individuals, and family is the center of everything. And so you move and stay in the family. Now, what you frequently see here, for example, on Oahu, is you might not find the families actually living under the same roof, but they'll be living next to each other. So if you go to Kaimuki, for example, it's very common to see a cluster of residences next to each other that are actually members of this sort of extended family. The two that actually are reflecting a patrilocal system that you intentionally move in with or next to or alongside your family members, and you're interacting with them on an hourly, daily basis like that. That's very much the norm here, which is another way that we're very different than the mainland United States. Here, it's a very positive thing. On the mainland, it's generally looked down upon, and neo-local is the way that you're supposed to go. The last of these is one that I sort of grew up in, but just take this for whatever it is. I'm not going to bother explaining in detail. If we ever start the Native American class, I'll go into it more. This is what we call avunculocal residence. Avunculocal residence, you have to visualize your family tree thing. It's tied into two things. One, it's tied into matrilineal systems. One of the interesting aspects of matrilineal systems, and we actually see this a lot in Micronesia here, is that in matrilineal systems, the mother of some kids, of course, the husband moves in with her, and the kids are raised in the mother's family. It's a matrilineal, matrilocal system. In that situation, what you're generally going to find is that the female side of the family, the males that are actually born in that family, take as part of their responsibility much of the child rearing of kids. So you're going to have a clump of kids in the mom's family's, place. Her brothers are going to be the ones that rear the children. Her husband, i.e. the guy that moved in with her, he's going to be responsible for rearing his sister's children. This is actually very typical in matrilineal, matrilocal societies. The main male identity person that raises kids, especially boys to be men, is going to be the brothers of the lady, or in other words, the guys that are born with the same last name. The guys that move into a family keep the responsibilities to take care of the family they were born into. So even though the guy moves, his responsibilities sort of stay at home with his birthplace. And so in that situation, what you get is the idea that in many cases when you grow up, the person that you're closest to is going to be your uncle, your mother's brother, because he's actually the guy that sort of raised you, what Americans would call to be your father figure. So you find in a fair number of Native American societies, which very frequently tend to be matrilineal, matrilocal, that the guy that you grew up with and you try to live with when you grow up is going to be your mother's brother. So avunculocal systems they're not particularly common, but they're not super, super rare. They just require that you have a real different mindset in terms of the idea of what you might call generational or parenting responsibilities, which are totally different than the American norm. And as you might expect, if you're on a reservation or in a Native American community in the United States, this would mean that if you had like a parent-teacher night, the guy that's going to show up to talk to the teacher about the kids is going to be the mother's brother. It's not going to be the biological father, which can get the school system really agitated if they're not familiar with this, because they keep on saying, well, where's your dad? Or did the dad abandon the kids? And it's like, no, he's busy with this, doing this other stuff. I'm the one. And they're like, well, you're the uncle. What do you got to do with it? Because of course, in the Anglo-American system, uncles are pretty much an abstract, except maybe at Christmas or something. So avunculocal is very typical with Native American groups, especially in the Midwest and the Southwest. But it's not something that's understood by Anglo-American society. So just be warned, that's what that means. If you ever bump into it, it makes a lot of sense. If you're not familiar with it, it's probably something, if we had quizzes in this class, it'd be a real good multiple choice quiz question. So that's sort of where the marriage stuff stands up. I'm going to see if I can find, there was actually this great catfishing episode. If I can find it, I know I can't download it on YouTube because they threw it out because it was, stolen off of the air. If I've got it as a download, if I can, I'm going to put it in Panopto, and I want you guys to watch it, because catfishing was actually a really interesting documentary that was done, I think, about 10 or 15 years ago, about the idea of digitally based relationships. And of course, there was the big issue with the famous football guy here, Manti Te'o, when he was, I think, finishing university or something like that got into one of these relationships that turned out to be a real furball. So catfishing is really, really a fascinating concept. It's very much a social media concept. It's really interesting because what you talk about, and if I get this episode, what's really interesting is the amount of emotional investment that people have in these relationships. And of course, you're fairly familiar. In fact, one or two people have already brought this up in reaction or in critical thinking papers, is that in the world we live in 2020 especially, social media relationships in many ways sort of dominate our sense of who we are and our sense of self. Even though in most of these cases, they're actually involving people that we don't know. And we don't even know if the way they present themselves in social media is actually who they are. Think of that instantly, I think, if you watch it. This makes it real interesting when you look at the stressors in terms of, people's sense of self-value, self-worth. If suddenly people jump all over their case on social media, as happens all the time, and you suddenly look at that and realize that, of the 100 people that say they hate you, you're real stupid, that you don't know 99 out of them, and the other one's your cousin, and you think he's stupid too. So, it's sort of really interesting how this has evolved into something that didn't exist before. If you think about it, back in the phone call period, when all you had was phones, or even, pre-social media, anonymous phone calls were just something you hung up on. I can't imagine how you would do something like this in a writing period. I guess you could have people write anonymous letters to people, but why would you read them? I think they'd just tear them up. So this is very much a factor of social media. And you have to remember, in the modern context, social media has been around for less than 15 years. So you guys are basically the first generation that's growing up with social media as part of your world. And our ability to handle that is still not very good. It's still based on prior concepts of what relationships are like. So I'll see if I can get that catfishing one to you, and I think you'll find that really interesting. If you get a chance, and you probably go to Netflix or something like that, go and watch the actual documentary that was done, which is very well done. It's the same guys, I think. In fact, I don't know if they're still on TV. I think they were doing it as an MTV or some sort of network show. But take a look at that original documentary, because it's absolutely a fascinating example of the emotional content of social media. So with that, that's enough. That gets us through this one. And next time we'll get segue into a more complicated idea of group and the individual.